You guys know how it goes. There might be some cuts in the video, but hopefully you won't notice. So just quickly, I also have another channel. I'll link it below. It's just normal, everyday get ready with me. I just did a get ready with me over there to get ready to film this video. So yeah, also I am taking a class starting on Friday, and so the uploads might be a little more sporadic, but I'm going to try so hard to stay on a schedule. Right now I'm between like 7 and 8 days between videos, so I really want to try to stick to that because I've been enjoying getting back into it. Okay, people get mad when I have long intros, so let's get into it. I might have to do a part 1 and part 2 of this case because I have so many pages of notes on it. This is the Gilham family murder, and I found this case because of Casefile, the true crime podcast from Australia, and this case takes place in Australia. Yeah, I will link that in the description as well. So, cheers. Let's get started. At 4:30 a.m. on Saturday, August 28th, 1993, Ted and Jan Warner heard a loud knocking on their door. This was on Prince Edward Park Road in the southern Sydney suburb of Warronora. I have no idea how to say that. It's spelled Wauronora. So this was a very quiet neighborhood, so it was uncommon to hear this type of disturbance so early in the morning. When Ted opened the door, he saw his neighbor, Jeffrey Gilham, 23 years old, in just a pair of boxer shorts, smelling of smoke and also of some kind of kerosene or petrol. He lived next door with his older brother, Christopher, who was 25, and his parents, Helen and Stephen Gilham. They had lived in the neighborhood for 2 decades. They were sociable, well-liked, and viewed as loving and as a functional family. So there was no real drama with the family. They were just like your average family that you would find living in a nice little quiet neighborhood, if that like exists, but you guys know what I mean. Ted had known Jeffrey's whole life and had never seen him like this. He was usually neat, calm, and well-spoken, and at that moment, he was highly agitated and he was shaking as if he was cold. He seemed to be in shock, and Ted called 000, which is kind of like 911 for us in the States. And Jeffrey spoke with the operator, and he said, quote, "They're all dead. He's killed them and set them on fire. Mom and Dad are both dead. He's burned them, and I've killed him for what he did." I'm not sure if that is a direct quote, but he said something to that effect. He told the operator that his brother Christopher had killed his parents and set their bodies on fire, and he said that he street to the to the two-story home. This is just to give you a layout of the house and the property. The upper floor had a living area, a dining and kitchen space, and the parents' bedroom, Stephen and Helen's bedroom. Downstairs was Chris's bedroom, and Jeffrey lived in the converted boat shed, which was attached to the main house by a set of external stairs. At 4:43 a.m., firefighters arrived at the property to find smoke rising from the roof. Jeffrey was at the bottom of the external stairs and was in a bad emotional state. He was speaking incoherently about his dead parents. The firefighters found Helen, and she had been stabbed 17 times, and 13 of those wounds were in the chest. Stephen's body was face down with 28 stab wounds, 16 being in the front, and there was an axe next to the bed. Chris's body was next to the pool table in the rec room. He had been stabbed 17 times, with the majority of the wounds to his upper chest. A knife was next to his body. Jeffrey was brought to the police station and agreed to participate in an interview at 8:22 a.m. So, this is what Jeffrey told the police. He said that the previous evening had been an ordinary Friday. His girlfriend, Haley, had come over for dinner, and she left around 10 p.m. After that, he watched television with his parents in the lounge room, or in the living area, before he had a shower, and then he went to bed. He wasn't sure exactly what time he went to bed, but he assumed it was around midnight. He said he was totally asleep when he was awoken suddenly by the intercom that connected the boat shed with the main house. His mother, Helen, was screaming for help through the intercom. So he quickly pulled on his boxer shorts and raced through the garden to the staircase that led to the door upstairs. He said this took him less than a minute. He unlocked the door and ran into the lounge room. He was retired and loved to sail, play golf, and work at the local boat shed. And his wife, who was only 55, worked as a school nurse. She was fun to be around. They loved their kids, and they worked hard to give them a good life. Stephen and Jeffrey had a really good relationship, mostly because they both loved to sail and they loved boats and being on the water. Jeffrey spent a lot of his time not only sailing for competitions but also surfing. He also was studying to be a civil engineering degree. And when this happened, he only had 6 months left before he was set to graduate. Christopher Gilham, Jeffrey's brother, was more of a shy and reserved kid or adult at the time. He did go boating with his family, but he preferred to be kind of in the background. He was interested in fencing, computers, and piano, and neighbors kind of noted what a talented pianist he was, and they liked to hear him play. But according to Jeffrey, the winter was really hard on Christopher, and he was struggling to find a job, and he had become more reclusive and had become more agitated and didn't spend much time with anybody, but spent most of his time on the computer. And Jeffrey said that he had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to the incident. Jeffrey had told his girlfriend Haley that Christopher had quote-unquote lost it, and he'd been fighting with their parents, and getting physical with his father. And Jeffrey kind of felt like he needed to be the intermediary between the two. And even Jeffrey's friends reported that Jeffrey had been telling them how worried he was about his brother. So the night before the incident, Jeffrey had been telling his girlfriend about Christopher, and I think like within the week before that he had told his friends that he had to go home early to like check on Christopher and make sure that he wasn't fighting with his father. When he was asked what the fighting was about, Jeffrey didn't quite know, but he had an idea that it was because and they just kind of assumed that it was burned. So, for the death of Christopher, Jeffrey was charged with murder, and he was denied bail. He spent time in the psychiatric unit of the Long Bay jail, and he kind of had trouble, obviously, accepting what had happened, and was having trouble just adjusting to his life without his family and living in a psychiatric ward, obviously. But his friends and family, rallied around him, and they believed the story that he told. And he was eventually granted bail, on the condition that he undergo psychological counseling and move in with a family friend. So in April 1995, he did go to trial for murder, and he pled guilty to the charge of manslaughter. Two psychologists found that Jeffrey suffered from no ongoing mental disorder, psychiatric condition, or violent tendencies. They felt that he had simply reacted in a very extreme manner to the circumstances of Christopher being violent with his parents. So I think it's kind of interesting that there was no mention of self-defense, because Christopher or Jeffrey said that never said that Christopher came at him. So yeah, I found that to be interesting, because you get a lot of talk about self-defense in a situation like that. Not that this kind of situation is very common. So the judge and the psychiatrist, the psychiatric evaluators felt that there was very little risk of Jeffrey offending again, and that he showed remorse, and that he could be rehabilitated. So his manslaughter plea was accepted, and he was sentenced to 5 years of good behavior. Probation, I'm assuming. It says good behavior bond, so I'm assuming that means probation. And the judge just felt the whole situation was extremely remarkable and out of the ordinary. And then 2 months later, there was what's called a coronial inquest, which is, I think, a way to close the investigation. So the coroner found that the couple had died by stab wounds inflicted by their son Christopher, and they officially closed the case. So represented Christopher's like affect. He felt like he had seen Christopher within the past couple months and that Christopher seemed fine. But like, just because you see one little sliver of a family doesn't mean that you know them. Like, I just thought that was kind of like silly that he felt like everything was fine just because he spent like one day with them. Like, Jeffrey spent his entire life and all of his time with the family. Another reason Tony was suspicious is because of one piece of evidence that the investigators found at the crime scene. They found a 25-liter canister containing only about a liter of gas in the front of the house where the trash cans were kept. So the explanation from Jeffrey for that piece of evidence was that he and his father had cut a hose in an attempt to siphon some gas out of the car to use in one of their motorboats for an upcoming trip. They wanted to, I don't know what this means, but you might, they wanted to make a 2-stroke fuel, but then realized that the car contained the wrong kind of petrol, so they aborted their mission and put the can back by the bins. So Tony found that hard to believe because he felt that Stephen wouldn't have had to do that. He would have just had the right kind of gas on hand. And he just felt like that whole story was far-fetched. And he thought, so because Jeffrey smelled like gasoline that night, like in his mouth, and like if you're trying to siphon, I don't know, it is kind of a strange story, especially if he had showered after this whole ordeal. So Tony found that weird, and he thought that Jeffrey made up the story. This is where things get kind of convoluted. But Tony felt like Jeffrey had killed his parents and killed Christopher and then tried to set the house on fire using that gas. And, but he thinks that the gas didn't work, so he had to use turpentine. So that's one reason Tony felt that Jeffrey was covering up what had actually happened. And not only Tony felt that way, but his neighbors felt that way because this was the other piece of evidence that they felt was kind of off. Even though Jeffrey said he stabbed Christopher, he didn't have really any blood on him. He had a very small amount of blood, like one on his fingernail, a little blood on his fingernail, a little bit on his toenail, and like a little bit on his shin. So they were like, why doesn't he have any blood on him if he's stabbed somebody 17 times? Did he like shower before he came over? Or what happened? And then something else that Tony latched onto was the fact that Jeffrey was entitled to 100% of the estate. Originally they thought it was only 50%, so the rest of it got divided to his grandparents. But when the lawyer found out it's actually 100%, none of his grandparents were upset, except for Stephen's mother. She refused to sign her house over to him, and Jeffrey, like, according to Jeffrey, he didn't care. He was like, that's fine, like, I want her to keep her house, like, but Stephen's mother, Jeffrey's grandmother, told Tony So Tony brought these questions to detectives, and detectives actually agreed with him that some of the stuff was kind of sketchy. They felt like it was hard to believe that two separate stabbings could have occurred in the same household around the same time. And they felt like if Jeffrey was capable of killing his brother, that he could also be capable of killing his parents. They also felt that Jeffrey's reaction upon seeing his parents' dead bodies had been the fact that it had been just to attack his brother instead of like checking on his parents was kind of crazy. But I say maybe Jeffrey just knew they were dead because of how bloody they were. They weren't moving. They were like dead. So maybe that's why he just saw red and attacked Christopher. I don't know if you can tell, but I personally think that Jeffrey's story was true. But some of the evidence does. Oh, someone keeps calling me. Some of the evidence does give you pause. So the detectives also felt that the fact that Jeffrey smelled like gas was weird. They were skeptical of the timeline because someone across the street had heard screams at 3:45 a.m. and then the screaming stopped around 4 a.m. and then he didn't make it over to his neighbors until 4:30 a.m. So what had he been doing for half hour? The other forensic evidence that made them question the story was the fact that there were a majority of, like, the fact that all the stab wounds were similar, and there was a similar number of stab wounds between the parents and Christopher. So even though two separate people were doing the stabbing, they were really similar. So they were like, maybe Jeffrey did all of this because all the stab wounds were pretty similar. But forensics hadn't really been detailed enough to like figure out if there were small differences. The other thing, and then this also gave me pause, there were no fingerprints found on the knife, not Jeffrey's or Christopher's. So when I first read that, I was like, okay, like, obviously somebody cleaned the knife, that's pretty sketchy. But when firefighters were fighting the fire, a ton of water was used, so I think that fingerprints were kind of just washed away. But Tony Gilham, the uncle, wouldn't let this go, and he helped bring, he begged to reopen the case, and when detectives at first refused, Tony asked Jeffrey to meet with them, but Jeffrey didn't want to meet with them, and Jeffrey says that he didn't even know Tony very well, and he said he didn't want to speak to anyone about the night of the murder without his lawyer present, and Tony thought that was super sketchy. So he started to write letters to the Department of Public Prosecutions urging them case was closed, and then your uncle is like trying to dig things up because he doesn't believe you. So Stephen's mother, Jessie, was on 60 Minutes and said that she didn't believe that Christopher played a role in the murders at all. She described him as a lovely child with a beautiful personality who had no malice and was bullied by Jeffrey. Jessie recalled that Jeffrey would always like run into him on purpose whenever they walked by each other. And then 60 Minutes also had 4 separate arson investigators look into the case, and they found evidence to indicate that the fire had actually started in the main bedroom near Stephen Gilham's body, which created further doubts about Jeffrey's story. They also consulted a leading criminal barrister who raised questions about Jeffrey's timing of events. And then 60 Minutes also reached out to a forensic pathologist from New South Wales to examine the case on their behalf. So the doctor reviewed the crime scene photos and raised questions about the lack of blood on Christopher's body. And it had, on Christopher's body, so the dressing gown he was wearing had his own blood, but it didn't have blood spatter from his parents. He expected that he would be splattered with blood. But hey, here's the deal. The firefighters used so much water. That's probably why it's gone. I don't know why anyone didn't think of that. It seems like this case was so crazy that it made for really good TV, and that people just got in a frenzy about it and kind of lost all reasoning capabilities. And then the forensic pathologist talked about the no blood or fingerprints on the knife. So the forensic pathologist said he thinks that there was one killer and that it was Jeffrey. Jeffrey obviously declined to be interviewed for 60 Minutes. And the 60 Minutes segment brought the case back to the public eye, which is exactly what Tony wanted. And they decided to reopen the case in 1999, and they brought forward all of the questionable elements of the case. And there was also testimony that was delivered about Jeffrey's physical appearance at the time of the crime. And some recall that his hair had been wet, suggesting that he could have washed it. But then there was also testimony from a blood spatter expert. So I have a video about blood spatter and how it's not really a science at all. If I can find it, I'll link it below. But this blood spatter expert said that the lack of blood on Jeffrey didn't really hold any major significance. And he told the court that it was a common misunderstanding to think that the amount of blood on an attacker was linked to the because of all the water. So finally that's brought up. So after all the evidence that we talked about in the witness testimony was presented, the coroner found that there was sufficient evidence to suggest that Jeffrey could be responsible for murdering his parents. And they recommended that the director of public prosecutions consider laying charges. The only problem was a lot of the evidence had been destroyed because the case had been closed. So very few things were left over that could be DNA tested again. So without those pieces of evidence, he felt there was no reasonable prospect of securing a conviction. So Tony was obviously so upset by this, and he continued to try to bring the case to the public eye. And he even offered his own $200,000 reward for information. And in early 2004, 5 years later, thanks to Tony's persistent efforts, the homicide squad finally decided to reopen the investigation officially. And their focus was on uncovering new and compelling evidence that could convince the DPP, the prosecutors, that it was worth prosecuting. So, something that they noticed in the new investigation is that several items of Jeffrey's clothing had been found in the burned wreckage. And Jeffrey's girlfriend at the time confirmed this was the same clothing he'd been wearing when she'd visited the house. How does she remember? Like 10 years later. Anyway. So the fact that Jeffrey had shown up on the Warner's doorstep wearing nothing but boxer shorts, investigators wondered what his clothing was doing in the lounge room. An examination revealed that there was no blood on any of the garments, so they theorized that Jeffrey could have undressed before attacking the whole family to avoid getting any blood on his clothing. Which is so dumb. Like, don't forget about the freaking water they used to put out the fire. Anyway. So another piece of evidence that left me wondering is that Christopher Gilham's glasses were found on a windowsill in his bathroom, and he had an astigmatism, and he wore glasses at all times except when sleeping and showering. And according to his ex-girlfriend and a friend of his, he always kept his glasses next to his bedside. So because those glasses were found in the bathroom, it was assumed that Jeffrey had somehow surprised him with his glasses off to put him at a disadvantage. They thought that Jeffrey hid his glasses. Another argument was that they felt that Jeffrey's explanation for why Christopher killed his parents was weak. They didn't believe it. They felt like it was out of Christopher's character to try to kill his parents over money. They also revisited the story about siphoning the gasoline, but they just didn't have a motive, which you need. You have to be able to, in order to prove that someone committed a crime, you need a motive. Or in order to bring the charges they wanted to bring, they had to figure out the motive. So they came up with these 3 cassette tapes that apparently sounded the voice. They found him in storage, I guess, and with him giving a review of a book for an assignment, and apparently on the tape he said, I have a brother just like the main character in the book, and he always gets away with stuff just like the main character in the book, or something along those lines. Like, he said something negative about his brother in this tape, and they thought, oh, okay, that's a motive. Which, to me, sounds kind of crazy. And then they made the case that all of the complaining that Jeffrey did about Christopher, kind of acting out and fighting with his dad, was fake, that he was just trying to lay the groundwork to blame Christopher for these murders. So in 2005, the Homicide Squad submitted a brief of evidence to the Department of Public Prosecution, and they went in with the charges, and they served Jeffrey with an ex officio indictment, meaning that the case would go to trial without the need for a committal hearing. And by this point, it's more than 10 years since the incident, and Jeffrey had married his girlfriend Rebecca, and they had one daughter and another daughter on the way. He requested a stay on the indictment, arguing that a trial would be oppressive, unfair, or in breach of the rule against double jeopardy. The request was rejected, and the trial went ahead in February 2008. So the defense stuck to like their original defense, which had worked before, and then they also got Chris's eye surgeon to testify that even though Chris's vision wasn't great, he could still like maneuver around the house fine without his glasses. So they argued that the fact that Christopher's glasses were in the bathroom wasn't a tactical move by Jeffrey, but they felt that it was the reason the glasses were in the bathroom is because Christopher took a shower after killing his parents. And they felt that, and the reason they said that as well is because in one of the crime scene photos, it looked like there was a soap bubble in Christopher's ear. So they felt that Christopher took a shower, and then Jeffrey killed him when he found him coming out of the shower. The defense also said that the similarities between the stab wounds was purely coincidental. And then they talked about the water from fighting the fire and why there was like no fingerprints on the knife or blood on the knife, as well as no fingerprints in the Panadol in the laundry basket. So this part was kind of confusing for me. But they got an expert who tested the carbon monoxide level in all three of the victims to determine if they were dead before or after the fire started. So a normal level of carbon monoxide, if you're a non-smoker, is between 0.5 and 2%. All three of the Gilhams had higher levels of carbon monoxide than usual. Helen's was 3%, Stephen's was 4%, and Christopher's was 6%. So like when I hear those numbers, I think Christopher died last because his was the highest. And fire's level was like double Helen's level. He argued that these were within reasonable limits. And then he went on to say that if the body had a level of less than 10%, he would have assumed that that person died before the fire started. But anyway, I'll wait to go off about that. So this expert testimony ruled out the possibility that anyone other than Jeffrey could have lit the fire. So even though it was said that a normal level of carbon monoxide is under 2%, this guy said that 6% was normal. So members of the jury were unable to agree on a verdict, and the case was dismissed with a retrial scheduled for 2008. This time, the evidence presented by both sides was pretty much the same, and the jury deliberated for 8 days before delivering the verdict, and he was found guilty. The judge said that Jeffrey was an actor and a liar, and there was no reasonable possibility that the killings were a spur-of-the-moment reaction to some unknown emotional psychiatric disturbance. So, the judge sentenced Jeffrey to the maximum penalty of life in prison for both murders. Tony Gilham, the uncle, felt vindicated. He had been fighting for Jeffrey to go to jail for this for 13 years. So, at this point, Jeffrey had 3 children with his wife, and his wife and his friends were shocked by the verdict. So, his friends and family basically felt the opposite of Tony. They felt like they witnessed him grieve normally, whatever normal is, but they witnessed him crying at the funeral, whereas Tony said that he wasn't. They witnessed him struggling. Basically, it sounds like Tony just had this hunch and he got really, intense about it. While Jeffrey's friends all witnessed Jeffrey, mourning and having a really difficult time in his life, being really affected by these murders. And Jeffrey's friends felt like he had been so wronged by the justice system, and they felt like it wasn't a straightforward case, and it had taken the jury 8 days to find him guilty. So they were like, we gotta get Jeffrey out of jail. We need to figure this out. So they created a group called Justice for Jeffrey. And they got together, people with legal backgrounds, destroyed after the first trial, or the first case was closed. So they got the group together. I guess it wasn't called Justice for Jeffrey, it was called Jeff Needs Justice Support Group. And the group reviewed over 70 scientific research papers on stab wounds and discovered that the expert opinions presented at trial had no significant or scientific merit. The stab wounds are no more similar to each other than they were to stab wounds sustained by victims of multiple stabbings in unrelated cases. There was also an expert who said it wasn't safe to conclude that the 3 deaths were done by one hand, but they chose not to use this expert because he didn't fit their narrative. By they, I mean the prosecution. You know, it's kind of normal for prosecution and defense to cherry pick their experts, and that's kind of obviously what happened here. So the thing that most astonished the group was the testimony about the carbon monoxide. That 6% was significantly higher, and that can't just be ignored. So they got another opinion from an American toxicologist named David Penny, who had been studying the effects of carbon monoxide for 30 years. And he found that the levels of carbon monoxide showed that all 3 members of the Gilham family had been alive when the fire started. Professor Penny provided an affidavit discrediting the evidence presented by the other expert at the trial. And based on Christopher's 6% carbon monoxide level, he would have been inhaling smoke for 2 to 4 minutes prior to his death. So that was pretty good news for Jeffrey's case. Sorry, I gotta scroll for a second. The other big piece of evidence that worked in their favor was that these freaking cassette tapes that were quote-unquote found were not actually Jeffrey's voice. They had been recorded 5 years before the deaths, and so apparently this evidence became inadmissible because they were recorded 5 years before that, but the jury heard about them, so it kind of got in their minds. But when Jeffrey Needs Justice Support Group listened to them, they were not Jeffrey's voice. This wasn't even Jeffrey. And they were able to track down the man whose voice it actually was. And he had no link to the Gilham family. So I don't know where the heck these tapes came from or how they ended up in the hands of the detectives, but it wasn't Jeffrey. A member of the group named Paula was tasked with going over some of the scientific evidence, and this is another big piece that helped them. She watched the crime scene video for the first time. So as she watched it, she saw a bloody fingerprint next to the call button on the intercom, and it was pretty obviously a bloody fingerprint from Jeffrey's mother. So if Jeffrey had killed her, why would she use the intercom to call Jeffrey? The intercom only went to the boathouse where Jeffrey lived. So that is pretty damning evidence for Christopher being the killer. spent over 3 years in jail. Jeffrey Gilham, at the age of 42, his double murder conviction was reversed, and he was released on the condition of $100,000 surety. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I'm assuming it's like a bail, whatever. He was released, and it was reversed. And he was able to leave. But the Court of Appeal still had to decide whether he would be subject to a retrial. The panel was divided, but the majority was 2 against 1, so he was finally acquitted of all charges and officially declared a free man. Tony, his uncle, was outraged, but 3 weeks after Jeffrey's acquittal, Tony died of a heart attack at the age of 60. Which is kind of a sad ending to this story, but his family said that he'd become so obsessed with the case that he developed a drinking problem, was smoking a lot, and never slept, and he was just really burnt out at the age of 60. So, super tragic story, family ripped apart. I still feel like I feel 95% sure that Jeffrey did not do it. But I'm also so curious about Christopher's motives. Why did he do this? It didn't really go into it that much. It talked about how Jeffrey, or the podcast talked about how Jeffrey said that Christopher was having a hard time, but it didn't really go into it. So I wonder if there's more information out there. I was gonna go to the Reddit, but my internet's not working, which is really annoying. Yeah, so I wonder if there's more information out there about Christopher, and maybe the motive of why Christopher did it. Anyway, so I think a lot of people still believe that Jeffrey did it. I don't